The year is 1691, exactly 1 century after the legendary Christopher Belmont defeated Dracula. Romania had been at peace, but during an Easter celebration, the powers of God weakened. As a veil of night descends over the countryside, the hearts of men are once again enraptured by an everlasting curse. Gathering at a deserted monastery at the edge of civilization, a shadowy group of cultists conducts a mass to resurrect the Count of Wallachia. As a bolt of lightning strikes the building, sounding off through all of Transylvania, the Lord of Vampires returns from his ashes, and so does his castle. This time though, the Belmonts are ready. For this monster, there is only one remedy. Christopher's descendant, Simon, is the man now entrusted with saving humanity. Simon barges through the castle's front gate, Morning Star in hand, and enters the very same crippled halls that Trevor had faced all that time before. But Dracula's armies nowadays are nothing compared to then. He defeats zombies, panthers, and then, rather than heading up like Trevor had, moves down into the watercourses. The fishmen there aren't the biggest deal either. As he climbs back, his first great challenger reveals itself, a giant bat. But this one's nothing like the previous ones with the ability to split themselves. As it swoops down in desperate strikes, it's defeated by the crack of the whip. Castlevania was first released in 1986 for the Famicom in Japan, where it was known as Akumajo Dracula. It was released in the following year for the NES for the rest of the world, and it's the first ever game of the Castlevania franchise. Took me a while to get to it because of course there's a lot of prequels that came out later, but now we're finally here, and we can experience the journey of Simon Belmont, the most iconic Belmont of all. So iconic in fact, that there's multiple retellings of his story, but let's do this in parts, one thing at a time. So, Simon, look at him, he's in Smash and everything. He got multiple designs throughout the series, but this first one here is the most recognized, and it's based on the barbarian aesthetic that was popular in the 80s. You know, He-Man, Conan. I think the developers wanted to go for a quintessential Western hero feel, so that's what they picked. In the same vein, the weapon they gave him, a whip, was inspired by Indiana Jones. This very Western influence on Castlevania is especially noticeable in the early games, and it's not just the Dracula novel or the whip, I've mentioned it before, but a lot of the bosses that show up in the games are in reference to the classical horror movies from Universal Studios and Hammer Film. The whole idea of a castle infested with all these big baddies is very reminiscent of stuff like House of Frankenstein or House of Dracula, which are these nonsense crossover movies with monster meetups. So pretty much Castlevania, save for the Belmont. And these inspirations permeate the whole franchise, but are especially noticeable early on, and even more especially in the very first. The first game, as we'll see as it goes, is kind of framed like a movie. The ending even has these fake credits to real-world actors, though they change up the names to be a little funny. It's silly, but they're really acknowledging their origins, I suppose. Origins which the series would drift further and further away from as more and more games got released. Starting from Symphony of the Night with Igarashi in charge, the series would be completely revamped to abandon the Western look and go for the more gothic anime feel of Ayami Kojima, drawing inspiration from many other places for its monsters. I don't think this transition was bad per se, it gives the series more identity, but I do kinda miss the monster flick feel when I'm playing the Igavanias. Let's talk gameplay. As you might have noticed, Castlevania 1 plays almost the same as Castlevania 3, they're very similar games. Heavy jump, whip with 3 forms, and the usual 5 sub-weapons. The fireball whip that Christopher had was not carried over to his descendant. Logically speaking, that's because this game was made before that was a thing, but maybe in universe, Simon just never learned the technique, or it was lost somewhere down the family line. For now. Also worth noting is that unlike in Castlevania 3, Simon is alone in his journey, so there will be no quirky extra characters this time around. I sped through the first stage a bit, but there's not much, it's the castle entrance. I do find interesting how Simon starts out right at the entrance though. If you remember, Trevor has a whole quest outside the castle before he can get in, and Christopher does start right outside, but he still has a graveyard and a cave stage before properly entering. Simon just waltzes in. This is why I claim Dracula's armies were pretty weak this time. It's been getting easier and easier to enter his castle, and that creates this feeling that Dracula himself is losing power. Of course, I'm making up this lore, it was not intentionally written by the developers, but I still like to take a look at stuff like this. I'll have more to say later. The first boss, like I said, is the giant bat, which is pretty standard for vampire stuff. I hadn't mentioned before, but it does also show up on movies of its own. Pretty cool. Something else worth noting is the item the bat drops. Its remaining energy apparently coalesces into this ball called a magic crystal, which fills up your health bar. I hadn't mentioned these before either, but they show up in many Castlevania games. They don't really have any lore explanation as far as I'm aware. They're kinda just a thing that exists for video game reasons, and even then they don't make a lot of gameplay sense either, because you could just restore the player's health without giving them an item. I mean, it's not like Mega Man 1 here. It's not like Simon is absorbing the power of this bat, he just killed it, that's all. Or I mean, I guess he is absorbing its power and using it to heal himself? Can the Belmonts, like, use soul energy to heal? Is that a normal thing they do? The magic crystals have different functions depending on the game. In Lament, you can use them to modify your sub-weapons, in Belmont's Revenge you don't collect them, Dracula does, and in Legends they grant you soul weapons. In the original classic Vanias though, they serve literally no purpose other than healing you for the next stage. They'll show up again, so keep an eye out. Like I said, don't expect much lore behind them. You're probably tired of me yapping. Let's get back to the story then. Simon proceeds into towers and halls guarded by knights, or animated suits of armor, whichever they are. This level ends in a chapel, and it's an inspiration for many levels of the same type. It introduces moving platforms and the Medusa heads, which can be really tough and hard to predict on your first time. And there's also these spike traps that always get me. I think their hitboxes are a little wonky. It's a considerable jump in difficulty for a newcomer. I remember being pretty frustrated at the knockback you get from being hit, getting thrown into pits by the Medusa heads. This is a point in the game at which I've seen more than one person give up completely, but it's designed to get you used to the movement and attack mechanics. If you can figure out the Medusa heads and get through this level, you're pretty much set to beat the whole game. Well, save for some of the bosses. Speaking of, the boss here is in the chapel I mentioned. Appropriately, it's the Medusa herself, now back to being a statue of a floating head, though not as big as before. Her last canon appearance before this was CV3, where Sypha destroyed her, so she probably never recovered her body after being embarrassed like that. Due to the lack of Sypha, she is a little harder here, but also simpler. She just floats around and spits out snakes. No petrification or anything like that. Most sub-weapons are pretty good against her since she is a slow moving target, but she's also one of the few bosses in the series who can be frozen in place by the stopwatch. The giant bat is another one, so she's a really easy kill if you happen to have that. Medusa is, of course, partially inspired by the Gorgon movie from Hammer Film, as I mentioned in the Lament video, but she's also just one of the many creatures from Greek mythology that make it into Castlevania. Now we reach the top of the castle halls, which look pretty battered here, mostly a pile of ruins open to the sky. In my opinion, this is one of the better looking stages in this game, though it doesn't compare to the beauty of CV3. This introduces the Fleamen, or Hunchbacks as they're known in the US, which are the bane of my existence. Also ghosts, but those are easy enough. Overall, I think this stage is a step down in difficulty, though it does have a lot of pits you can fall into in the bridge section. I really like how you can see the final tower in the background here, with the staircase leading to Dracula and everything. That's where we'll be by the end of the game. The bosses are the mummies, which are just chilling in this dark tower, and they're a little more threatening than the ones in CV3. They're based on the mummy movies, yada yada, and they work really similar to CV3. They walk around shooting bandages, but they're harder to avoid because this time you can actually break the block and not be able to get back up on the platform. Contrary to the stage, these are a big step up in difficulty, I think. They're really hectic, but if you have an appropriate sub-weapon, you'll be fine. Cross and especially Holy Water are really good, but even Dagger can get you through. After beating the mummy, Simon just fucking drops down the tower and survives somehow, but I guess Sonia did that first in some alternate timeline. He dives into the caves underneath the second half of the castle. I don't know why he didn't just drop, like, out of the tower, like, why did he need to go underground? Anyways, this is a cave slash catacombs slash watercourse area, similar to the stuff we've seen in CV3. The first part of the stage is pretty difficult, firstly because of the moving platforms, secondly because of the respawning bats, and thirdly because it just looks really ugly. These colors kinda suck. These skeletons on the ground look like you can step on them, but no you can't. And the fishmen go through the ceiling. I remember all this stuff made this part really tricky when I first played, but thankfully I've got it down by now. After climbing up the stairs, you cross this ruined palace hall while getting the classic Fleaman bombardment, God bless, and there's this bone dragon you can walk straight by. The inside of the palace hides Frankenstein's monster, who's also just chilling there. Now this one is accompanied by a little friend named Igor. Igor is just a flea man really, but he's a reference to the movie trope of mad scientists having those evil, crazy, hunchback lab assistants, specifically to Igor himself as he appears in Son of Frankenstein. This trope has no foundation whatsoever. The original Victor Frankenstein did not have any lab assistants, but he's very important here. Unlike in other games, this creature doesn't do much, it just kind of walks back and forth, so Igor is there to jump like a bitch, throw fireballs, and fuck you up. He doesn't take damage. You can hit Igor, but that just makes him freeze up for a moment. Your real target is the creature, which can be really hard to focus on when you're having to dodge this tiny motherfucker. This fight is really chaotic in a way that makes it not very fun. That's the case for most bosses in this game, to be fair, but at least the early ones are manageable, even with just the whip. The creature kinda sucks pretty hard. Again, the easiest way to beat the boss is by using the appropriate sub-weapons, and again, that'll probably be the cross or the holy water. Yeah, they're the best weapons in the game. The holy water is not as good in the later Castlevanias, but in this one it is broken because it actually freezes enemies in place when they're hit. Normally that's not a big deal because you can only have one sub-weapon on the screen at a time, but if you get the double shot or the triple shot upgrade, you can fucking spam so much holy water and completely paralyze bosses. As you can see here, it's by far the easiest way to deal with the creature. It takes zero skill at all. Feels like cheating, honestly, but I do it anyways. To be perfectly fair, it can be actually kind of hard to reach this boss with the triple holy water, because if you die on the way, you just lose it, or even if you grab another sub-weapon by accident, you also lose it. So even if you cheese the boss with this strategy, you still have to, know the game and do quite a bit of work to set this up. It's an interesting dynamic, like you're preparing for the monsters you're off to fight. Sucks that said preparation mostly involves triple holy water though. Stage 5 is the Abandoned Dungeons, which in this iteration don't have any of the traps they had in the previous titles I covered. It introduces the Blood Skeleton, which gets back up after dying, but isn't really that hard, just a bunch of hallways. The true challenge, and possibly the hardest part of the game outside the bosses, is the final hallway at the top, which has 2 knights and infinite Medusa heads. It is hell, it's pretty much hell. However, as I'm sure you will not be surprised to hear, the easiest ways of getting through it are either using the cross or the holy water. If you have one of those, especially if you have double or triple shot, you can just spam them and stay on the move, and you should be perfectly fine. The boss is Death, or the Grim Reaper, as the manuals call them. As usual, he protects the final areas leading towards Dracula, being his general and all. And this fight is even messier than the creature, because it works a lot like Death did in CV3. He flies around and summons floating scythes, which can be really hard to manage, but thankfully there's no second phase, and if you have triple holy water, you can destroy the poor guy before he even starts. Death, by the way, is the only boss in this game with no direct movie equivalent, but of course he's a popular enough concept. In the original Japanese manual, he's actually called Shinigami, which in Japanese culture is kinda like a death-related spirit. But it isn't a unique being, like there's not a single Shinigami, there's many. Later on, they kinda retconned that idea to make Death a singular demon sort of creature, more akin to the Western interpretation. Anyways. The clock tower is the end stage, as usual, and this one is the first one in the series. It opens with a short bridge section that's populated by giant bats. Yeah, the same ones as the first we fought. I really like this trope of bringing back early bosses as normal enemies in the late game. It's really cool. That being said, you should not fight these fuckers. It is not worth it. Just run and pray to God they don't hit you. The clock tower itself is actually pretty bare bones with no real mechanics. You kinda just climb stairs and haul ass before a billion fleamen swarm you. And that's it. Pretty short stage. The stair climb, under the moonlight, takes Simon to his destined fight against Dracula. The legends of Trevor and Christopher were both well known by this point. The brave man who'd killed the Count twice before. This one's about to be the third death, fourth if you count Hector's fight, and fifth if you count the first time Christopher fought him. By this point, it's become pretty clear that there's something very wrong going on with this asshole. He was originally slain in 1476, his armies vanquished, his castle destroyed. Hector just made sure that would last for good. But exactly 100 years later, all of those mysteriously returned. That time it was Christopher who put a stop to it, even if only a decade after the resurrection. And then once more, 100 years passed, in 1691, there stands again the Lord of Vampires, facing his killer one more time. It's probably around this time that it becomes undeniable that the Belmont's fight against Dracula will not be ending anytime soon. His reincarnation cycle is discovered, this being one of the main pillars of the Castlevania franchise, as you probably already know. In Simon's time, he was brought back by an evil ritual, and in Christopher's time it's not very clear, but either way, the one thing these resurrections have in common is that it took precisely 1 century for them to happen. Apparently, that's the time needed for the forces of God to wane, for the curse to regain its power and bring evil back to life. Remember, Dracula isn't just a vampire anymore. He hasn't been since the 15th century when he made his pact with the deity of chaos. That's what makes him so powerful. He and his castle, which are kind of one and the same, are like avatars of evil. As long as evil exists, so does its deity, and so does its emissary. Yeah, Dracula's just the devil. Straight up, you cannot beat the fucking devil. He and his minions will always return from the deepest pit of hell. The games don't much explore the implications of this to Dracula's character, but I think it's just so interesting. In an act of pure spite against humanity, he turned not just immortal, but eternal. He's not just a dude anymore, he's a force of nature and destruction, and if the whip doesn't keep him in check, he will destroy mankind. There's also deeper philosophical implications surrounding this, the curse, which is what effectively resurrects Dracula, is often described as the evil in man's hearts. In other words, it's evil itself that resurrects him, the sins of humanity. He's a personification of those sins. But that'll be brought up and discussed in future games, so let's get this over with already. The first phase is pretty bare bones, as this is the first Dracula fight in the franchise. Teleport, fireball, that's it, just aim for the head. I don't know if it was intentional, but I do find it very interesting how Dracula's sprite here looks a little skeletal, like an actual undead, not just a sexy, middle-aged man. His second form is this cookie monster looking beast, which is supposed to be some sort of werebat, and according to one of the developers, the personification of the curse. Canonically, this is the first time Dracula uses this transformation, but there is something similar in Adventure Rebirth. It looks kinda goofy, doesn't it? Both these forms tie into something I've been alluding to since the COD video. The games kinda make it seem like Dracula is getting weaker every reincarnation. He definitely was in COD, Hector even comments on that, and that's the whole reason he wins. In the Christopher games, it's never stated that he's weaker, but his second form looks pretty underwhelming when compared to every other game, and in the final fight he doesn't even have a second form. I mean, Christopher even beats him alone, which is insane considering Trevor needed 3 allies to stand a chance. And now this time, he just looks like an actual corpse. He even comes straight out of a coffin instead of sitting on a throne. He has a second form, sure, but it is not on the level of his third one. His monsters too. If you play the series in chronological order, it seems like his armies have been progressively shrinking. Of course, that's an illusion. Castlevania 1 feels easier than Castlevania 3 because it came before Castlevania 3, not because the developers were trying to establish complex lore like what I'm spouting here. But even then, I find the idea that Dracula's been getting more and more feeble to be an interesting thought, because lore-wise, he undoubtedly gets stronger later on. Keep that in mind, I'll get back to that in a few videos. For now, all you need to know is, just like Christopher, Simon managed to win on his own. Probably with Holy Water, that's the easiest way to beat the werebat. It doesn't even hurt him because you need to hit the head specifically, but it still paralyzes him, so you can just fucking stun lock the final boss. Beautiful. And as the third, or fourth, time, Dracula died. Good riddance. That's the movie credits I mentioned. Really peak cinema experience right here. You can even get a second round if you want with the second quest, but I haven't played that, as usual. That was Castlevania 1, the first game in the series. I really like it, and I think it's a decent enough starting point for someone looking to get into the series, specifically the classic games. It is kinda janky, but it was the actual first Castlevania I played, so I'm kinda biased in favor of it, I guess. I'm also kind of desensitized to a lot of the jank because I've played it a lot, but it's definitely easier and more accessible than Castlevania 3. On that note though, I do believe Castlevania 3 is the better game. I think it improves on almost every aspect of the first, it's longer too, but it is cool to get back to this one every now and then. I think it's a more laid-back experience, if you know what you're doing. Now, the direct sequel to Castlevania 1 is the infamous Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, taking place just a few years later. But as I've alluded to, there's quite a few games we might want to talk about before that. See, there isn't just one Simon's Quest, there's many of them in parallel realities that may look slightly better or slightly worse depending on the case and on the person. Simon is one of the poster childs of this franchise, that's what got him in Smash, and so it's no surprise that he's the character with the most games to himself, even if most of those are technically non-canon. There are no less than 6 Castlevania titles starring him, 7 if you count one remake. 6 of those are retellings of the same story, and one of them is the sequel I mentioned. That's a lot of ground to cover, but I don't think I could call my series whole without covering it. So now that we know the story of Simon, the original legend that birthed this titan of a franchise, I figured we can take a look at the variations of the myth, how they differ from each other, and how they're similar. My next few videos will be dedicated solely to this sexy man, and I guess the best place to start this Marvel multiverse bullshit would be the game that's closest to the original experience, a title which I had not played prior to starting these videos, and which surprised me in many ways. The very first Metroidvania of Castlevania. Okay, not really. Castlevania 1 actually has a bunch of different versions and ports which look and sound slightly different. I will not be covering those because they're effectively the same game, just a bit worse, but such is not the case for Vampire Killer. This game was released about a month after Castlevania 1 for the MSX home computer. At the time, the whip didn't have a name yet, so the title refers to Simon, not the whip. The original Japanese title, by the way, is Akumajo Dracula. That's the same name as the NES game, so they're meant to be the same game, kind of. Vampire Killer was just a port for the MSX, in theory, but in practice they made it quite a bit distinct from its progenitor. The story of Vampire Killer is the same. The levels look really similar, the bosses too. The more obvious differences are in the soundtrack, the fact that it's a little uglier, and that it controls kinda bad, probably because it was designed for the keyboard. But the level design and how the levels work is where the shift is really at. Like the first stage is the castle entrance, same as the original, but you quickly realize it's all a little off. The level's divided in a bunch of smaller screens, and it isn't linear. Each section loops around itself like a Pac-Man screen. This is why I said this game's almost a Metroidvania. The gameplay consists of exploring an area, finding a silver key, and then finding the door to the next area. Each stage has 3 of these areas mirroring the original game, and at the end of them you fight the local boss. On paper, it's a pretty simple game. It even gives you a bigger health bar so you can explore more confidently, take more damage. But don't let that fool you, Vampire Killer is not simple nor easy. In fact, I'd argue it's stupidly hard. The first thing that ups the difficulty is that item hunting is a pretty big part of the experience. The silver keys are frequently hidden inside illusory blocks or hard to reach areas, which can make them rather annoying to get. But that's just the beginning. You also have chests that you need golden keys to open, and there's also merchants that you find inside walls and whip to see what they're selling. What the fuck? And these two can grant you a myriad of different items. There's shields to block projectiles, stage maps, healing potions, a speed boost, a jump boost, the holy water, and stopwatch sub-weapons, which you can have both at the same time, by the way, and the main weapons too, which can be either the chain whip, the cross, the axe, or the throwing knife. It's a lot of options, and you don't need all of them, but knowing what you need for each stage and each boss makes a huge difference when you're playing this. This game is not just about being good, it's also knowing what items you need for each area and where to find them. which is a really cool idea. Castlevania 1 also had a bit of this, but this goes beyond. You really feel like you're an actual vampire's lair, slowly preparing for the hunt. You lose all the items when you beat a stage, so you always have to start from scratch, and it's interesting. If this was the extent of the game's difficulty, I don't think I would mind it too much, but it's not. The second thing that ups the difficulty is that Vampire Killer has no continues. 0 of them, total. That means if you die 3 times while playing, you have to start the whole game over. Whose idea was this? Tell me, whose idea was this and bring them to me. I like to talk to them, personally. Friendly conversation. But seriously, this decision is baffling. I imagine they wanted to make the game tougher, so people would take longer to beat it after buying it, but that's stupid. Starting a game over after dying a few times, it's not good game design, period. It never was. This turns what could have been a weird but cool little game into something I would never want to play, unless I'm using save states, which is exactly what I did, by the way. I played Vampire Killer twice for this video, and both times I used save states at the start of every stage. It's dumb to expect players to do otherwise. The game is easier than the original, kind of, but having a big health bar does not save you from everything. All the stages have 1 or more sections that just flood you with the most annoying enemies known to man, drain your health, and fuck you up. Couple this with the fact that healing is kind of hard to come across, and this game is a pain in the ass to beat in just 3 tries. So how was my experience beating this game twice? Well, it was quite informing. For my first playthrough, I went in blind, just figuring out the game on my own and mostly ignoring all the items. I just wanted to get the silver keys and reach the bosses as fast as possible. This was very challenging because that's not how you're supposed to play the game, so for my second playthrough I used a guide which helped me find the keys faster and grab the weapons I actually needed to beat the game. This was much easier and more enjoyable, but I still had to resort to save states due to how hectic these screens can get, especially the ones with Medusa heads or Fleeman. There isn't much to be said on the stages themselves. They're very similar to the original, just expanded or modified to serve the exploration, so I guess I'll just go over some highlights instead. The first stage is pretty standard, not too maze-like or anything. The keys are very straightforward. The axe in this game actually works like the cross, by the way, like a boomerang. It doesn't go up. Also, if you fail to grab the cross or the axe when they're flying back to you, you just lose them and revert to the letter whip. Really stupid. But my actual point was, this makes the giant bat a little tougher to deal with. The best way normally would be using the axe, but it doesn't go up here, so the best way now is using the stopwatch, or the hourglass as it's called here. That does make it very easy. Stage 2 gets really annoying with the Medusa heads, and it gets even better at hiding keys inside walls. Not as annoying as you'd think, you kinda get used to whipping them after a while. I think the start is the hardest part here, especially this moving block part. Hourglass is your best bet here. It's also your best bet for Medusa at the end, which is in line with the original. By the way, the time stop in this game works against every boss, not just the first 2, which makes it insanely powerful. Stage 3 has this awful gimmick where 2 screens loop when you fall through them, and you need to figure that out if you want to get the key, which is pretty annoying. It has this awful Medusa head Fleeman combo, which makes it hard. The mummies are tough as usual, and I don't think there's an hourglass in this stage, but you can use either the throwing knife or the cross to make them a joke. Stage 4, the cave stage, is still really hard. The first key is nice, you can see it right at the starting screen, but you need to loop around the stage to be able to reach it. But the following section is not as cool, because it can soft lock you out of the silver key if you break the wrong blocks. Also, it bombards you with Fleeman. But you can get the holy water here, which is important. The last section actually does something pretty unique with these tunnels you can crawl into to warp to different points of the stage. It's a great idea, but it's so confusing if you don't have a guide. You can soft lock again here, by the way. Game design. The creature doesn't get paralyzed by holy water in this version of the game, but it's still really useful against it. Combine that with a cross and you barely have to play. Stage 5 starts awful with the skeleton and Fleeman placement, so you have to make good use of the hourglass to climb the stairs, but the later portions with the knights are much easier. That really tough haul with the knights and Medusa heads from the original game is absent, so this level's a bit relaxing even. Look at these goofy ass paintings of Dracula, by the way. Why does he have a beard in only one of them? Death is a bit harder than in the original, naturally, since you can't stun lock, but hourglass does the trick. And finally, stage 6, the clock tower stage. is quite a bit longer. They expanded it to match the rest of the game. The bridge section has a bunch of items you can get if you explore the underside, but I skipped that completely on my second playthrough. The first silver key is literally right by the door. You don't need to go anywhere else. The section after that is very confusing, but with the guide, I managed to get the hourglass and the throwing knife, which was all I needed. After that, I was scot-free. The final boss, of course, is still Dracula, looking even more skeletal now, and my feelings about him are very complicated. I played this game twice, right? Once without any guides, not really exploring much, so by the end of that first playthrough, when I reached Dracula with my last life, I had absolutely no items other than a stage map. No sub-weapon, no shield, not even the Morning Star, only the leather whip, and this made the fight brutally difficult. I could barely dodge his fireballs, my whip was too short to reach his head, he had way too much HP, and I accidentally saved over my previous saves, so going back was not an option. There were literally no items that I could get at that point. I'd saved right at the boss door, and I had no choice other than beating him. I spent so long trying to do it, because even after I got the first phase down, there was still the second, and the second phase in this game isn't just a cookie monster like in the other one, it's this giant Dracula painting possessed by his soul. Okay, that's a little silly, also a little cool, but why does it have to kick my ass so hard? You're supposed to hit the gem at the top of his head, but I didn't have any weapons to do that from a distance, so I had to climb those stupid blocks over and over to then jump towards the gem and try to hit and probably miss because my whip was way too short. Meanwhile, Dracula was spitting out unending swarms of bats that were impossible to dodge, unless you were at one of the bottom corners or knew their very specific pattern. I eventually figured the pattern out, as you can see, but I still had to repeat the climb, jump, whip pattern for what felt like hundreds of times until I finally nailed the boss. It was absurd. And yeah, I admit it, that was my fault. That was entirely my fault. This is not how you're supposed to play the game. You can't just walk up to Dracula without any items and expect to win. You're supposed to find or buy them in the earlier parts of the stage, so you're actually ready to take him on. This is how the first phase is supposed to look like if you did the actual work and research. And this is how the second phase is supposed to look like. Yeah, I just became Dio to beat Dracula, except he's the vampire, not me. It looks boring, I know, and it kind of is, but like I said earlier, I think the feeling of actually preparing to fight Dracula and then going in and destroying him like you're fucking Batman is pretty unique, and I believe that's what this game was going for. It certainly achieved that to an extent. In conclusion, this game is bizarre. It takes Castlevania 1 and tries to make something almost completely different out of it, and it has good ideas and would have been mostly harmless if it had infinite continues. The fact that it doesn't makes me a lot less likely to enjoy it in any capacity, but I don't regret playing it. I'll have more to say later. Now that we've covered Vampire Killer, we can go just a little bit further. It was actually not the only Castlevania game to release just a little after the original and feature the same storyline. In the tail end of 1987, we got a second one. Though unlike Vampire Killer, this one does things quite a bit differently. Haunted Castle is an arcade title released shortly after the previous two. In fact, it's also known simply as Akumajo Dracula in Japan. Story-wise, it's pretty much what we've already seen. Dracula returns in Simon's time, though this game adds a wife for Simon named Selina. She is immediately captured by the vampire at the start of the story, and this is what pushes our Belmont into action. The very fact that this game is arcade already makes it pretty different from everything else in the series. It's mostly akin to a classic Vania, kinda similar to CV1, but its challenge is less platforming and more learning to deal with all the enemies and traps the game throws at you. This game is known for being brutal, one of the toughest in the franchise, and that makes a lot of sense. Most arcade games are unfairly hard. They're meant to be, so they can eat as much of your money as possible. So knowing this, I was not looking forward at all to playing this one for this video. And yeah, it kinda sucks. Haunted Castle has a lot of unforgiving gacha moments, enemy barrages, and the like. This is compounded by the fact that no matter how many coins you have inserted, you only get 3 lives per playthrough, no continues. So if you die just 3 times, you're sent back to the first stage, same as Vampire Killer, which is fucking awful. I was hoping I could cheat my way through the game, since the emulator has infinite coins, but no, they thought ahead of that. Instead, I had to resort to using save states again after every boss, because there was no fucking way I'd put myself through this hell otherwise. Granted, I did play the Japanese version, which is easier overall. It gives you more health, and it also makes bottomless pits not kill you, they just drop you to half health and put you back at the checkpoint. It's actually kind of weird even, because if you're already at half health when you fall, you don't even get any penalties, you just get sent back without taking any damage. Anyways, even then, it was not enough. Making this game have no continues was a really bad idea, which can only be explained by capitalism. But at least it makes more sense here than in Vampire Killer, since, again, this is an arcade game. With me saying all that right from the start, you probably figured I absolutely hated the game, right? No, I fucking loved it. So this game is really distinct from everything else in the series, and you have to play it with that factor in mind. Every stage is a gauntlet of challenges that are hard to predict, but easy enough to manage if you know they're coming. And to my own surprise, I found myself actually enjoying the gameplay loop of slowly progressing through stages, figuring out what they have in store, until I could finally beat them. These stages aren't actually hard, they're just unfair, but they're perfectly learnable, and learning them was a really fun experience, even if I had to use save states to do it. Let's get to the game and see what you think. Right from the start, both the aesthetics and the stage selection makes it clear that this adventure will be its own thing entirely. It begins with a banger original soundtrack in the setting sun, which quickly gives way to a city in darkness and a haunted graveyard. It has a lot of statues and tombstones that will crumble and damage you if you're too close, so you have to tread carefully. This breaking monument mini-boss is the first big roadblock in the game. It's not impossible to get through, but very tough to dodge. Other than this, there's not much yet. You should easily be able to get to the mausoleum, where you find the living statue of Medusa. Look at those sexy breasts. Her only attack is spawning snakes, and if you have a sub-weapon, it shouldn't be too hard. Yeah, by the way, the sub-weapons are also weird in this. Instead of holy water, you get just a fucking bomb, like an actual explosive to throw at monsters, which is based as hell, I guess. Other sub-weapons include a boomerang, replacing the cross, the actual cross, which works kinda like a laser, a stopwatch, and a torch. Keep the torch in mind, it will be very important. I'm not joking. This game has a map, by the way, with this funny looking Simon sprite. It actually sets Dracula's castle inside a body of water, which might be the first time that's happened in release order. Damn. Heading through a misty forest in which you can see the castle in the distance, Simon explores the second stage, mostly inside a cave with weirdly colored water. The main threat here is these boulders with funny cartoon sounds, and this rock dragon near the end. But then we exit the cave into a hellish looking sickened forest to face the Bone Dragon King, his first appearance in the series. We've seen him in Castlevania 3 previously, also Belmont's Revenge, kind of. Probably the easiest boss in the game, especially if you have the stopwatch, very easy to dodge, even without it. By the way, this is the first level in which you can get the Morning Star, which is actually an entirely different weapon that does more damage, not just a transformation of the whip. It's also a permanent upgrade, even if you die. After this monster is beaten, the bridge to the bloody-looking castle is extended. The entrance halls and banquet rooms is where the game essentially begins. This is the first really hard stage, with hunchbacks, ghosts, spiky chandeliers, bouncing eyeballs, and animated armor. It plays just as insane as it sounds. I obviously died a lot here before I got it down, but it's a really interesting level. I think it looks really pretty, even if the 18th century France aesthetic doesn't fit the time period. And it has a bunch of weird things, like these paintings that cry literal bloody tears, the soundtrack that's playing, and this weird door to an alternate dimension that looks like ancient Greece, where you're attacked by harpies? What is this? Seriously, what the hell is this? Infinite corridor confirmed in Haunted Castle? You can also net the final weapon upgrade here, which is the sword. Strangely rare to see a Belmont using a sword, but you can here. And it's pretty useful because the boss is coming up. Meet the Stained Glass Knight, born from a stained glass window. I don't even know if it has any attacks, I think it just jumps around. Though it is made difficult by the fact that the hunchbacks can fucking follow you here. Then you're in the cavernous basement of the castle, which for some reason has a lot of mummy caskets. These are really hard to dodge, their bandages are like unavoidable, but if you position yourself just right, you can quickly kill them. Same for the respawning bats. Just like the previous level, this one is really tough, but it's also short, and with enough practice, you can get it all down. This is what I enjoy about these stages the most, I think. tough, unfairly tough, but short enough to get you motivated to beat them. I don't really know how to fight this boss, to be honest. It's like a giant stone golem, in fact, the first golem in the franchise, but it likes to fire undodgeable volleys of rock. I kinda just tried over and over until I beat it. The clock tower stage is challenging, but I actually got it pretty easy in comparison. The elevator in the start can be intimidating, but once you know where to stand, you'll mostly be safe. It's pretty boring otherwise. The clock tower part is really only in the background, there's no cool gimmicks or anything, which I guess is also true for Castlevania 1, the game had like 0 gimmicks, but it was still more inventive with its platforming. I get platforming really isn't the focus of Haunted Castle, why would it be, but this does make the later levels feel pretty much like straight lines. Strangely enough, the clock tower boss is the creature, not Death. Death doesn't show up in this game. They probably decided to focus on the actual horror characters instead of other stuff, but the creature looks like an absolute unit in this game. That man is huge. He can use his chains to attack you and does the whole falling blocks attack before Castlevania 3. Notice that the scientist who created the creature seems to have died in this very room just after giving him life. Is this Victor Frankenstein? Well, it wouldn't be, because going by the original story, Victor Frankenstein would be from the 18th century. So who could this be? The lore deepens. No, it doesn't. This game isn't even canon. Okay, the last stage straight up sucks. It is entirely comprised of a single, very long bridge leading to Dracula's throne room, but the bridge is collapsing and there's bats flying towards you, and every time you stop to hit a bat, you fall back a little and eventually fall off the bridge. But if you don't hit the bats, they hit you and send you back. Peak game design. So there's like literally no way to get through this part unscathed, at least not as far as I could tell. The strategy I eventually developed was just jumping and tanking most of the hits. You can keep about half your health bar if you do this right. There's a harping in the throne room or coughing room, but after you take care of it, the real attraction comes quick. I found Dracula looks a lot like he does in the Hammer movie here. He doesn't have much health, but he likes to move a lot, so it's hard to consistently hit him while also evading his attacks. A sub-weapon is really useful here, because it'll have more reach than your sword, so you can attack from farther away. Takes a while, but he goes down. Then his second phase is yet another big surprise. You've seen werebats, you've seen painting, now you get Big Head. This has to be the funniest Dracula fight ever, especially because if you have the torch, or really any sub-weapon, he dies immediately. Barely even a second, the torch destroyed him in my playthrough. And the only thing he does is spit out these little dark beads, I think. So, yes, really underwhelming final boss. But I mean, when the whole game is the final boss, I guess that's quite alright. Simon gets his bride back, Dracula's gone, you know the drill. But you see what I mean, right? Haunted Castle is really unpopular with the general Castlevania fanbase, for obvious reasons. It's a game that's deliberately made to not be enjoyable, but if you've tried it already and didn't like it, maybe give it another go. The Japanese version, specifically. Use save states as you want and just see how much fun you can have once you have infinite lives. Even if the last few stages are kind of ass, especially the last one, I can still say I honestly enjoyed cracking these challenges. Though nowadays, I guess most Castlevania fans wouldn't see even touching this one as necessary, because much like the adventure, Haunted Castle got a remake that makes it actually good. Yeah, if you hadn't heard, Haunted Castle Revisited was released in 2024 as a bonus for the Dominus Collection, which focuses on the Nintendo DS titles, but I guess they wanted to put a little treat in there for the fans. The collection also has original Haunted Castle with save states to boot, but I don't imagine many people actually finished it. Revisited is the most recent Classicvania title released. The second most recent is Adventure Rebirth from 2009, so this game was a very welcome surprise last year, and it does not disappoint. As you can see, it has beautiful pixel graphics which blow the originals out of the water, especially the backgrounds just look incredible, and the original already looked pretty alright, if a little muddy. There's remixes for all of the music tracks as well, and they sound fantastic. The gameplay is much improved, with better controls, the usual sub-weapons, though they kept the torch and the boomerang in place of the holy water and the stopwatch, and the cross works like a screen clear. Yeah, it's very much inspired by Adventure Rebirth. Even the whip has 3 forms, but the third form is a temporary upgrade that makes it longer and pointy and flashy. I really don't have much to say about Revisited because unlike Rebirth, it actually sticks very close to the source material. The bullshit is incredibly turned down of course, but the level design is essentially the same with few changes here and there. The bosses are much better, some of the best in this series. They have actually consistent, readable patterns and they're fun to fight, even if they're a little on the easy side. Bit too easy in my opinion, I'd say. See, Revisited toned down the arcade aspects of the original, but it didn't really replace it with proper difficulty. It's a very short, easy game that you can beat in like 30 minutes. I think it might be the only Castlevania game I have not gotten a game over in, and I'm not even that good. This game is a walk in the park for a Castlevania fan. Even the harder bosses, like the creature, I just tanked his hits and managed to beat him. It was laughable. You also get checkpoints right before each boss, which I appreciate. That's good design in my opinion, but it contributes to this game feeling really tiny. I did play on normal difficulty. I suppose hard difficulty would be more challenging, but it wouldn't change the length of the game. My point is, I like Revisited, I really do, but I wish it had gone the Rebirth route and actually been a whole new game, not just a new coat of paint over an old one. That would have been plain awesome. It's not like anyone lost anything, I guess. Revisited is probably the definitive way to experience Haunted Castle if you don't want to deal with any of the crap of the original. It's also a surprisingly good starting point in the series, since it might just be the most approachable Classicvania. It's packaged with other games, so it's a little expensive, but I think that makes Dominus Collection a really attractive offer. You can both get yourself into these acclaimed Igavanias from Konami and get a little taste of Classicvania that might just incentivize you to try the other ones later. Yeah, moral of the story, just recommend fucking Dominus Collection to your friends if they want to get into the series. Oh yeah, Dracula has probably the coolest change in Revisited. The first phase is pretty similar and goes down really fast. Oh my god, he throws knives at you? Jojo rap? But the second phase has 4 big heads instead of just one. And the actual Dracula isn't the head, it's this red crystal floating in the room. I think it's so. You have to dodge some pretty tricky patterns while trying to hit the orb. It's a cool revamp of the concept. Hard, but also doesn't have much health. And the game lets you respawn after the first phase if you don't game over. I still enjoyed it. So in this video, I explored 3 very different games, even though they were all Classicvanias. Castlevania the First is an amazing one. Very good start for the series, the foundation of it, though I don't think as good as 3, but really solid, with awesome visuals and gameplay and presentation. The other 2 games were released very close to the original, stuck to the same story, and just tried to put a different spin on the gameplay. Vampire Killer went for an exploration route, a bit reminiscent of the later Metroidvania titles, while Haunted Castle was an arcade gauntlet designed to be frustrating. And both of these were frustrating. They had good ideas, but couldn't or wouldn't execute them that well, and the fact that neither have continues and force you to start from scratch every game over really hurts them both. I enjoyed them, but only saving true. I didn't know this when I played it, but Vampire Killer has some pretty cool patches to fix a bunch of things, for example making you have infinite continues and changing up the music. I'll leave the link in the description if you want to try it. It does make the game much more enjoyable, but no patches like this exist for Haunted Castle, as far as I can tell, which is very unfortunate. Haunted Castle does have Revisited, which is a very good remake that makes it bearable to play. I do wish it had been more though, gone further. It's just short and easy as it is. I guess I'm happy it exists. But you know what I would have liked even more than a longer Haunted Castle? A Vampire Killer remake. I think that would have been baller. I just think its ideas are really neat and deserve a second chance. And for the record, there is a fan game out there called Castlevania ReVamped, which is a Metroidvania adaptation of Castlevania 1. I don't think it's directly inspired by Vampire Killer, but it looks awesome. I want to play it, haven't done that yet, but I will. Maybe I can make a video on it in the future. Anyways, would still be cool to see Konami themselves trying to put their spin on this. The story of these games is mostly the same. Haunted Castle just adds Selena, but she's kind of a nothing character, more like a plot device really. Speaking of which though, there is a theory that the original intention of Castlevania 1 was for the plot to involve a kidnapped wife figure, which makes sense. Vampires kidnapping love interests is a theme that shows up all the way back in the original Dracula novel, and this theory is mostly supported by the fact that the main collectible in Castlevania 1 is the hearts, which has always been very strange. Like, the hearts work as ammunition, why would they be hearts? But if they're supposed to represent the power of love or something, like they're left behind by Selena, then it kind of works. Other than that theory, standard plot, same old. Dracula comes back, Dracula dies. Of course, now the reincarnation cycle is very painfully obvious. Every 100 years, the bastard comes back. And unfortunately, this time around, he'll come back a little earlier, on two separate instances, kind of. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still two titles that explore Simon's first story. They were both released a little later, in the 90s, and they had very different takes on how to redo Castlevania's original plot. But this video is long enough as it is. We'll be talking about those two for the next time, and then we'll move on to the actual conclusion of Simon's journey. Later.